Let me welcome you to my home this summer 2023. I came here to New Orleans the moment the pandemic began in 2020 and just never left. During that time, I retired and moved on, and since I never climbed aboard the social media train, I've lost contact with just about every colleague and Texas history fan that I know. I'm Cashion, by the way. 5 years ago, had a book come out, Lone Star Mind, Reimagining Texas History, that anticipated our field being swept up in a culture war over the contested ownership of our common history. Many of the speculative issues I discussed are now playing out in real time, which makes it all easier to understand. Anyway, the book began by identifying a tipping point that we've since reached where we become detached from a collective sense of identity that defines who we are as Texans. It's a pretty good indication that history is not doing its job, and it's also a condition that's not likely to remain static. What followed since the book appeared is something I framed my work around, that culture war over competing versions of Texas history that pits progressives against both traditionalists and a conservative power elite that has managed to remain mostly in the background. Shining the light of day on the power elite will probably change the way that you see what's going on. In fact, you can look at this contest through the lens of class warfare, one that's been started from the tops down. There are two Texases, but not a conservative one and a progressive one. It's the power elite versus ordinary Texans on both sides. Know that our uncertain times are being made even more chaotic by the divisive strategies of self-appointed spokespeople for traditional Texas history, as well as by the approaches of progressive historians who are reluctant to let go of some outdated attitudes and behaviors that could help us round the corner where the cultural turn is transforming the way that we practice our craft. The development and ascendancy of cultural history has begun enabling progressive scholars to break free of the ideological insistence that has so often straitjacketed the efforts, especially of social historians. The broadly encompassing nature of cultural history has enabled it to, or has empowered it, better to say, to absorb and assimilate the redeeming aspects of other approaches rather than overtaking them. To make more sense of history, it has also shown itself capable of importing ideas and methods from other disciplines too, in order to illuminate what we're studying as historians. Despite this kind of progress, Texas historians have been slow to get ahead of events conceptually and philosophically by finding new ways to understand and explain the past in a way that penetrates the anger armor of traditionalists who've been conditioned to view academic history as some kind of existential threat. And don't get me wrong, it is in fact an existential threat. Not to traditionalists, though, but to the powerful interests who are trying to move society in a direction that is not in the best interest of the common will. What neither side in this ground level contest between progressives and traditionalists, say the ground level contest, what neither side has acknowledged is that in the long view of Texas history, this tipping point I mentioned signals the end of a 2-century epoch that is characterized by the dominance of Anglo men and the beginnings of a new age whose identity and values will be defined in part by the way our cultural flashpoint here shakes out. I mention this up front because it provides the context for everything I'm going to talk about today. This moment in time, the way history works, and why it doesn't seem to be working right now. When we're finished, you should have a clear-eyed panoramic perspective of the reasons why everything seems so chaotic. To me, there were two closely related phenomena that are coming into view that were responsible for all the turmoil in our Texan lives today. One of them is epical change, and the other one is the emerging post-Christian age. If you think, it's going to take some explaining, but if you think of Texas history in epochs, ours began when First Nations had only nature and each other to contend with. Once Europeans arrived, a contest of empires ensued, in which Spaniards and Comanches eventually settled into a violent coexistence. We then pivoted to a third age where Anglo males achieved ascendancy. And and this is important to understand this, but don't think of these men as Southerners nor Americans or even as Texians, but simply as Anglo men. Of course, there were political and economic differences among them, but the society they built worked to the benefit of Anglo men. Viewed through this lens, the present epoch appears to be running its course grudgingly as we transition into an entirely new era, the fourth one since humans first began occupying this land. This epical change is gaining synergy with something entirely without precedent, the beginnings of a post-Christian age. Together, they're the source of wokeness for progressives and the fountain of anxiety for the traditional elite and traditionalists, or for power elite and traditionalists. I really wish that the term didn't make a dog whistle sound. I mean, calling it post-Christian is problematic for obvious reasons. My gosh, if you think about how much mileage people like Michelle Haas have squeezed out of CRT just because it has the word race in it, good gosh, imagine how the fanatics are going to run with this one. But let me make something clear, though. No one's coming after Christians, nor is our sense of spirituality as a people waning. It just means that we're moving into a more secular age where religiosity is a private matter and where everyone counts and on their own terms, which is actually so profound that it is truly an epical phenomenon. Plainly, whether it's the church, the government, or other institutions of authority, they are losing ability to pressure society into conforming to traditional behavioral standards. And so regardless of the new national climate that settles in on the other side of this culture war, more and more Americans, including Texans, will be increasingly seeking their values and identities in places beyond conventional customs and mores. There's a bottom line here that we are fundamentally changing as a society, evolving even, which demands a new story that is relevant to all Texans on both sides of our culture war. Now, this is important. Because of this epical shift, there's no us and there's no them. It's just a bunch of people in the 21st century trying to make something trying to make sense of something that happened in a completely different era. That kind of distance, it should breed objectivity. I mean, after all, it's human nature, but the emotional intolerance that people like Michelle Haas and J.P. Bryan have injected into the mix is only getting in the way of serious reflection. Lone Star Mind proposed that the best path forward for traditionalists who are more interested in a new common usable past than in greasing the skids for the power elite is a mature reconciling this epical phenomenon we're experiencing. Personally, because of people like Michelle Haas and J.P. Bryan, I see no indication of that happening anytime soon. Even so, I have a simple admonition for traditionalists who seem willing to carry a torch and a pitchfork on behalf of these people who want to storm the castle. History tells us that when political identity becomes more important than religious identity, it's going to screw you up. The church has been the big loser every time. And by extension, the people who fell for the siren call of ignoramuses with agendas, for lack of a better term. And you'll understand that better when we get closer to the finish line here. But I would further admonish traditionalists to consider what their long game is and then to think it through. What I'm saying is, you can handle this crisis of this coming post-Christian age by pretending that epical change is not really a thing and just continue being confused and upset. They can be aware of it even without acknowledging it, despite what I've just said about political and religious identity, and keep trying to roll everything back with that 1-2 punch of hateful rhetoric and hate-fueled legislation. Or, a third way, they can acknowledge it and try to influence this coming age in a way that befits the Christian faith. Before we stray too far from the main event, though, let's start moving towards discussing the stakes in this culture war. They're a lot higher than anyone seems to appreciate. I want you to understand something, too. The people engaging us, particularly Michelle Haas and J.P. Bryan, as I've suggested, they're not the people we're really fighting. They're mercenaries for the power elite, whether they realize it or not. This is a good place to introduce a brief excerpt. It was an abstract matter when I wrote about it, when it was published 5 years ago. It said the relative obscurity under which Texas historians have labored stands a good chance of giving way to some overdue attention. How much of that interest will be welcome depends on whether it emanates from academies outside of the state or from riled up Texas history buffs who suddenly notice that most of what their leading minds have been producing over the past generation challenges everything those enthusiasts thought they knew. If the ascendancy of cultural history has reinforced any singular notion among progressive scholars, a notion their detractors know by instinct, is the conviction that culture, as much as politics or economics, is central to maintaining power. To people like Michelle Haas and J.P. Bryan, then, this contest, this culture war, it's not about understanding the past. It's about power and keeping their peeps on their side of the battle lines. These people are over trying to take the machinery of our state historical association, just like the radicalized people who've been taking over school boards and local governments. Seems plain enough to me. Makes perfect sense, too, when you step back and you examine the first couple of videos that Michelle Haas did in that series, The Unmakers of Texas History. It was like she was following a formula. Confuse them with non-sequitur arguments and find a straw man and start striking matches and then never let up, so the people you're inciting don't pause to reflect on just how transparently deceitful you are and frankly how stupid you sound. Here's an example. Ms. Haas rolled a clip of Walter Binger being interviewed, settling on the spot where he was asked whether educators could hope to engender consensus on America's history, and he responded in part by suggesting that historians stay humble and avoid treating those who seem wrong-headed with disdain. I thought it was curious that in the very next frame, Michelle leapt to the conclusion that Walter labeled every single person who reads traditional history as a white supremacist. Man. Anyway, she could have taken issue with Walter saying wrong-headed, given the fact that progressive historians have so many faults of their own to correct, or she could have made a valid point that there's nothing humble about our beef with traditionalists. But if her goal, though, was merely to keep her side agitated by hyperbolizing the whole white supremacy thing, then I say job well done. She took the low road because the contrasts are much sharper down there where she lives. And the questions it raises lead through a rhetorical sea of mud, an historical reference that should sound familiar to every Texas history lover. What I mean is that she presents arguments that must be set straight before you can even begin responding to them. So instead of a productive debate about the concept of wrong-headed, we end up in an unproductive pissing contest over things that don't matter at all. Before we move on, though, I want to acknowledge something. Acknowledge the 33 years of war that social historians have waged on traditionalists. And after all, you realize it was scholars who framed this contest as a war in 1990, right? Of course, you couldn't have expected anything less given the times, but it was an even bigger mistake to declare a war on a genre, and then it was supposedly moribund, and then leave it to die on its own, knowing full well that it was baked into the identity of Texans who like to brag about being Texans. Anyway, scholars also waged war by leaving traditional history and the popular culture almost entirely out of the historiography. In fact, any association with the popular culture was not a good look on you if you want to be regarded as a serious scholar. Nevertheless, the popular culture, it does have an intellectual arc, and it has evolved in some ways that scholars don't seem to appreciate fully because we spend so little time contemplating it. Contextually, it's managed to keep traditional history relevant to its enthusiasts, and it does so despite the growing canon of work discrediting it. So I think it's worth looking at traditional history to explain it and see why. It's time to turn the corner, folks. It's going to take both sides to do it. Personally, I don't see that happening anytime soon because the way both sides are amped up. But anyway, ultimately, though, what appears to be an irreconcilable conflict. It actually has a host of solutions in scholarship that we're just not exploiting. There are many avenues capable of moving our wreckage forward, sorting it out, and getting it back on the road. Here's just one. I posted a YouTube video lecture to my class a few semesters ago before I retired about a logical triad. That's a theory. You see, kind of like CRT is a theory, except this actually has some substance for our situation. It says you start off with an orthodoxy that explains your stuff, and eventually an antithesis begins forming. You work through it, and eventually a new orthodoxy appears. And by that measurement, my friends, I say with a straight face that we're 2/3 of the way there. Of course, this 200-year-plus old Hegelian dialectic, or logical triad, as it's also called, presumes that the orthodoxy and the antithesis enjoy a little back and forth, and here we sit with neither side talking to the other. And that's not the only way forward, not by a long shot. My gosh, at a time when the cultural turn is busy absorbing social history and opening up more wiggle room for a fuller story, let me continue placing everything that's going on with this culture war into the context of what my research told me. Excuse me. Again, whether it's Texans, Americans, or even something more sweeping, our society is experiencing a fundamental change. And this tectonic break is capable of directing the traffic of ideas, framing every far-reaching historiographical discussion. And you'd think it'd be a great time to be a Texas historian. Man, I do. But there's a political reason, though, why Michelle Haas, shoots at us from the margins there. She doesn't engage us directly. The fact that everything she says is a little shaky because she doesn't know how history works. I mean, I'd be wanting to avoid us too. But progressive scholars, though, progressive scholars don't have that excuse for failing to engage traditionalists. In fact, a few weeks ago, I had an interesting conversation with a diehard social historian, a friend of mine who's giving me the same tired old ad hominem talking points he's been reciting since I've known him. Somewhere in there, I told him that we need to try the path to reconciliation. Excuse me, I'm getting a little cold here. Anyway, it begins with letting go of some old ideological attitudes that stand between scholarship and a new usable past. And here's where he started laughing in my face. So I said, one that rolls into it the redeeming elements of the traditional worldview. As I finished my thought, though, he quit laughing just as abruptly. Because I told him that doesn't mean watering down a new usable past with cowboys and Indians history. What it does mean is that if the narratives we write fail to contemplate the experience of Anglo males, their self-interest, and their worldviews, they'll be just as big a whoppers as the great white lie that we've been demonizing since 1990. It's as simple as that. End of story. This presents a problematic issue because progressive historians have invested so little energy in trying to understand the traditional history or the minds that identify with traditional history. Let me venture something in the spirit of reconciliation and consensus. I'm going to get personal for a moment, but when you look at Texas historians as people, as individuals, it doesn't surprise us that my dear department colleague of 20 plus years, Bernadette Pruitt, does Black history. Or that another colleague, Uzma Karashi, does immigration, race, and ethnicity. So why should it bother us that Don Frazier, who comes from a traditional Texas background, does traditional history? I mean, he filters his research through the self-interest of his people. Just like Bernie and Uzma, he brings a different trope to the table, but it expresses the self-interest of traditionalists in measured, logical tones and in ways we could all benefit from. That is, if we're serious about sorting out our wreckage and moving it forward. Let me note that Michelle Haas has no connection with the center Don runs before I go on to it. It'd be a huge mistake to associate his scholarship with her confidence game. I don't hold friends that I've known for 30 years and more to political litmus tests, and it sure licks all the red off my candy when I hear other friends I love, friends I've also known for 30 years, tell me that Don's the enemy and they should be looking at him as a valuable resource. Because that tipping point I mentioned, the rules of engagement for scholars need to be more of a downhill mission than a downhill fight. Again, that calls for reconciliation and consensus. Yet, most of us keep swinging in the same old ways like we're still fighting uphill. Willfully ignoring traditional history, it distances us from understanding the traditional mind, which just as surely distances us from factoring in the politicization of history when we live in a time when politics cannot be separated from anything we do. Let me drop an excerpt in here from Lone Star Man. It says that, rest assured that in the eventual telling of a new usable Texas past, there will be no return to the two-dimensional good old days in the multi-dimensional world of the 21st century. Over the sunny romanticism that once shone upon the civilizing institutions of a mostly 19th century Texas, the recounting of familiar tales from the perspectives of men and women whose voices are only now gaining volume have roiled into dark clouds that true Texans can neither ignore nor explain away. At the same time, scholars who would begrudge the accomplishments of a society whose benefits accrued mostly to Anglo men and then dwell inordinately on the social costs are not likely to provide entirely useful illumination. Alrighty then. Let me tee up the stakes in this culture war. In the globally contextualized environment that's taking shape, a contemporary Texas society composed of many cultures and attuned to matters of race, class, and gender, attuned to matters of class and gender distinctions, has found a declining utility in a largely 19th century past. For traditionalists, continuing to seek an identity and values in a 19th century frontier ethos that was propped up by rugged individualism, social Darwinism, manifest destiny, and similar traditions of American ideology, just doesn't work like it used to. And not reconciling these realities is is among the things that's keeping us apart in this culture war. As I'm looking at our predicament, something that has mystified me about this contest, I haven't found an appropriate explanation for. Why are we focusing on the 19th century when the emergence of modern Texas provides the essential context for explaining the way American culture is presently taking shape? Any historical account that attempts to trace such issues as the bifurcation of our political identity, the intricacies of multiculturalism, and the evolution of local markets in the global networks, without considering how the emergence of modern Texas has influenced the environment, will be unable to make full sense of the way contemporary America is truly developing. Let me read you another excerpt. It's a little longer than some of these, but consider the full weight of the historical implications arising from some basic Texas facts. Once perceived as the intersection where the South meets West, today the Lone Star State more accurately straddles the entire country, joining East and West with a network of highways, rails, airline hubs, and pipelines. It shares a porous 889-mile international border with Mexico and a 367-mile littoral border that connects its docks with every major port on the globe. With 3 cities among the nation's 10 largest, the mobile and overwhelmingly urban/suburban population of Texas, roughly 25 million, that's 5 years ago, and growing rapidly, is composed of virtually every ethnicity, culture, and religion. Nevertheless, it's the Tejano population that has added a triracial historical identity to the state's demography in a country that continues to view civil rights as mostly a black-white biracial episode, even if it has Hispanics have become the nation's largest minority group. An array of Supreme Court cases originating in Texas, ranging from matters of race, class, gender, and the limits of free expression to gun control and the reproductive rights of women, speaks for the state's role in further contouring the social landscape. Politically, Texas has produced 4 presidents and 2 vice presidents, 2 House speakers, and a Senate majority leader since the end of World War II, as well as a host of members in both congressional chambers who have presided over prominent committees. Moreover, Texas can boast 10 Heisman Trophy winners during that same time span. I think it's more now. Its military bases and involvement with NASA and the aerospace industry, its high-tech and medical research facilities, and an oil and gas industry is heavily subsidized as it is lightly regulated, bear evidence of the consequent influence its principles have thrown around in Washington, D.C., cultivating an economy whose GDP would rank Texas 14th among countries of the world. Culturally, if the state cannot match the contributions of places such as California, New York, and Massachusetts, The often benighted religious and social climate constricting the creative expressions of its citizens has been every bit as influential in shaping the American character and ways of life. Now, among the faults of scholarship I've discussed is the immovable center of gravity in our field. That is the epistemological core, if you want a more formal term, that resides between the revolution and the end of the frontier. Research historians we're free agents, man. We can choose topics and take the scholarship where we think it should go, but bottom line, too many of us disproportionately are still focusing on the 19th century. Let me remind you, we're going to be commemorating 200 years of Texas history, of Texas independence in 2036. It's just 12 and a half years away. Texas history does not end when the old frontier closed, and I would contend that anyone who says they're going to produce some sweeping account of American history without considering how the emergence of modern Texas, as well as the traditional Texan mind, have influenced the topic will be unable to make full sense of the way contemporary America is truly developing. Because of this moment in time, there's something else ratcheting up the stakes because we're in the middle of a side contest that factors in who we will become as American citizens. You're probably familiar with the concept of yin and yang. As the country's largest blue state, California, in effect, represents the yin to California's conservative yang in a contest of competing systems and philosophies involving concepts of wealth accumulation, influence peddling, business regulation, and all the basic rules of power that shape society. So you think about it. In the big picture, Texas isn't really as red as it looks from a distance, and if the state suddenly turned blue, it would be in effect game over for conservatives hoping to vote the direction our country takes. In every way then, a red Texas represents the linchpin for keeping conservative hopes and dreams alive, and parenthetically, maybe even keeping some of our local politicians and business people out of jail. Really, can you imagine all the delicious scandals that would begin popping up after so many decades of one-party rule and a pay-to-play philosophy? Just saying. Anyway, but for these reasons, the power elite will do anything to keep Texas red. When I say anything, forget about Fox News gaslighting half the nation for a moment, and consider that AT&T helped enable and finance the network OAN, One American News. We're talking about propaganda, conspiracy theories, and white supremacy. And to what end would otherwise intelligent people get together and decide, hey, that's something I can check off on? I ask you, and the oil companies, pretty sure they're already circling the old limousines, and for good reason too. They're threatened on one side by the prospect of a blue Texas, and on the other by people everywhere who take climate change seriously. You think for a minute, that what's going on here is not an effort to take over the machinery of our state historical organization the same way these people have taken over school boards and local governments. So I've told many a student, get real, big kid, handwriting's on the wall. Meanwhile, the state's one true investigative arm of journalism, the Texas Observer, had to crowdfund $200,000 from its subscribers a couple of months ago just to keep its doors open. In the wider culture war, this little flashpoint over Texas history might not appear to be so important at first glance. But when you look around with your eyes open, there's even more at stake at this moment than any of us can fully comprehend. Thus far, the response on the progressive side has been underwhelming. The power elite, whose leadership works through institutions they influence unduly, has an interest in keeping the tug of war over Texas history at a fever pitch. First, because it's keeping ordinary Americans from on both sides of the culture war from realizing they share more interests with each other than they do with oligarchs, but also because any enlightened sense of history might also and probably would affect the way they vote. To them, it's not about understanding our Texas past, it's about power. As long as our membership remains pissed off and confused, they're gold, baby. Here's another quick excerpt for you. In Texas, where conservatives have won every statewide election since 1996, the power elite has managed to consolidate its authority in large part by blurring the lines typically designed to separate political and economic cultures. Equally important, its hegemony has been enabled by a base that normally responds on cue to iconic images, whether it's hearkening variations of rugged individualism or by calling on its citizens to rally around perceived threats to their liberty. If, as progressive scholars have asserted, culture as much as politics or economics is central to maintaining power, then a traditional version of history that's lost much of its utility surely presents a conspicuous vulnerability to members of this power elite. Exploiting class divisions is a feature the power elite has naturally put to good use. I mean, it means they never have to get down there in the trenches. They just have to sprinkle a little gunpowder in our Purina and point us toward each other and then sit back and enjoy a good dogfight. And at the end of the day, all those pit bull-like assaults Michelle Haas has launched at us are the direct result of that equation. So through Michelle Haas, let me show you how the power elite works at ground level. I mentioned a lecture I posted a few semesters ago that examined our cultural war over Texas history. It explained the context and focused on the things that both sides, both traditional and progressives, are getting wrong, and then pointed a way forward. Before reviewing it, the students had an assignment for them to watch the first two episodes of Michelle's series, The Unmakers of Texas History. And I'm going to leave this lecture posted for the information it covers. You'll see the link down there below somewhere. Anyway, I felt like the videos, both of them she produced, were an overblown expression of a valid complaint that traditionalists have, and that is scholars don't pay attention to them. And when they do, it's usually to demonize them. When I first listened to Michelle Haas, of course, I was naturally skeptical of her intentions because she had adopted the combative rhetorical style of so many conservative talk show hosts. It was one-sided and just dripped with arrogant condescension. She relied way too much on sarcasm when making trenchant observation and asking honest questions would have suited her better. Nevertheless, she made some legitimate points, but they became lost in a kind of a hateful rhetoric that was either detached from reality or the product of someone with a huge chip on her shoulder, and also felt like she probably represented the other Texans who shared her views. So as long as there was a chance she would be educable, I gave her every benefit of doubt. I overlooked the right-wing media approach of her personal attacks and using sarcasm as her go-to. I didn't take issue with her baiting or even with the monumentally stupid things she said, all the while indicating no sense of shame. I was hoping that we were just dealing with a monumentally frustrated woman with a bullhorn and a Texas-sized ego who merely had an imperfect understanding of the way history works. I mused that perhaps she just doesn't know how we make sausage. So I explained. I put everything in the context of intellectual arcs that she would have had no way of knowing. Finally, I emphasized that despite the cross purposes of our two versions of Texas history, that our dilemma is not irreconcilable. Well, mother of all Burmers, her entire pitch was a con job, just as I suspected, but I had to make sure. But even before the recording of the lecture, though, I reached out to Ms. Haas through a mutual friend who told her that I thought she raised some legitimate concerns, and I was going to take her seriously. And after posting the lecture, I followed up at least twice and never heard from her. Still haven't heard from her. Now, I don't have a PhD in psychology like my big sister, but I'm going to crawl out on a limb here. You'd think that after complaining so bitterly about being shut out by university-trained historians that Michelle Haas would have been delighted that I took her Jeremiad seriously. As I said in the lecture, she raised some valid questions that deserve sincere, calculated responses. Many of my answers even strengthened her case, although hers is ultimately a losing one. No history that flows from a meta-narrative which says true Texans wrested the land from the wilderness, the Indians, and the Mexicans is going to hold up in the present age. We'll get to that. You know what? Michelle never acknowledged me, but she did post a string of videos on critical race theory. Let me explain something to my traditionalist friends who've listened to her riff on CRT and wondered if those 4 big steaming piles of hysteria that she packed into her series is proportional to the real threat it poses to them. First of all, it's an act. Second, in the intellectual history of Texas I wrote, closest I got to CRT was this, and I talked about it without mentioning it by name or elaborating on the concept. Didn't think it was that important, but here you go. Those othered out of the orthodox narrative have never fully identified with the true Texans' version of the 19th century past. For the sake of perspective, consider that Black Texans have viewed their historical role mostly from the margins of Southern society, both figuratively and literally. Of course, they did not construct their identity in opposition to the North and all it stood for, like the white Southerners did, but rather they envisioned it a separate identity by contrasting it with the white South and more locally with a white Texas. Now, you tell me, how could a people who were reminded daily that they didn't really count form their identity in any other way? Now, let me show you where Michelle's CRT arguments really fall apart, though. Imagine you got your narrative history sitting out here in front of you. We're going to tether to it some ideas and see where it takes us. You look up, and sure enough, there's a balloon tethered to it. It says CRT, and that's one way of looking at the history. Next to it is another balloon. It says logical triad, since we talked about that Hegelian dialectic there. But now imagine balloons labeled post-structuralism, phenomenology, discourse analysis, among many other balloons that what you learn. What do you learn about Texas history when you look at these other theories? I know. I filtered Texas history through more theories than I can recall. For example, let me just mention one. That I talked about up there, the discourse analysis. That one's particularly revealing because where revisionist studies are capable of exposing factual and interpretive flaws, discourse analysis further reveals how language in traditional history is used to project predictable and formulaic narratives. A good recent example is Myth, Memory, and Massacre by Paul Carlson and Tom Crum. Michelle wouldn't know any of that, however. She could care less because, by golly, she's going to float over the rainbow on that single CRT balloon with a big old scowl on her face. Hey, have I mentioned yet how prodigiously stupid she sounds? The woman has an imperfect understanding of what we do, but she's not obtuse, far from it. I suspect she knows something of the other side of the story. She just doesn't want her listeners to know. Rather than making serious logical points, 10 times out of 10, her go-to technique was sarcasm and ridicule. It was meant to discredit us personally and, in turn, discredit the history we write. Not much subtlety to her approach. Let me echo what I mentioned about Michelle following a formula of clouding issues with non-secular arguments and finding a straw man. If you haven't guessed by now, the straw man she chose is Walter Binger, our chief historian. Rather than telling you how she compared him to a petulant schoolgirl, let me mock her with a page from her own playbook to show you what she does. Now, have you ever watched the first seasons of Saturday Night Live when Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi were in their prime? And there's another cast member, Gilda Radner, and one of her recurring characters was an opinion journalist, Emily Latella, whose shtick was misreading a word or a phrase and then running with it, like confusing euthanasia for youth, like young people in Asia, or musing about violins on TV, violence on TV, right? Well, she'd tee off on a topic, each comment more ridiculous than the last, until Chevy Chase, playing the news anchor, finally set her straight. When the reality smacked her upside the head, she'd flash a self-effacing smile and go, "Never mind." And you know what? That's what Michelle Haas needs to say, and then go away. What often goes unappreciated, and something Ms. Haas and J.P. Bryan, too, need to understand, is the fact that research historians comprise an accredited profession. Membership requires rigorous training in the critical philosophy of history, which deals with theoretical aspects of the discipline, as well as speculative philosophy, which concerns itself with the significance of historical events and processes. Compounding this density of the demanding occupation is a dynamic historiography that's growing ever larger and more complex. Only after producing a dissertation, a work of scholarship that demonstrates a mastery of knowledge and a measure of originality, do professional historians gain license, literally, through the conferment of a doctoral degree in philosophy, to practice their craft. Some of them are capable of producing history that's accessible, and they do it well. Others are, frankly, incapable of reaching a popular audience, and there are those who are capable but seem unwilling even to try. So while there's certainly truth in the stereotype, it's not an accurate estimation. This cliche has a long history that's been cultivated tendentiously and renewed as circumstances and opportunities have allowed. And that's all Michelle Haas is doing. If you believe I'm being too hard on poor Michelle, let me tell you about the box she's sticking her followers into, and we'll see how much sympathy you have left for her. Now, when I mentioned a power elite that stays mostly behind the scenes, well, here's one of those issues that men standing at the political and economic levers of power and influence would prefer not to see exposed to the light of day, but here it is. Just like there's one kind of education for our betters and one for the rank and file, there's also a kind of history for the power elite, there's also one kind of history for the elite and another one they like to push for everybody else. After all, they're going to be navigating a much more complex world than the rest of us, you see, and that other kind of history, the one for workaday Texans, it's designed to make you loyal and patriotic. That's why our state's politicians also downplay critical thinking skills too. But bottom line, society's betters have a tremendous material stake riding on the survival of the Texas myth. It represents a bond of kinship, uniting the state's colloquial 1% with the unwashed masses of true Texans whose own material interests would otherwise pit them at odds. If you're a traditionalist, you might be on their team, but they're not on yours. Let me put this into perspective for you from personal experience. Before I entered a graduate history program, I worked for a utility company. If we wanted to make changes that would affect the subscribers to our public monopoly, we'd have to pitch our case to the Public Utilities Commission, the PUC. If we had too many lapses and complaints, they'd tell us to come back when we were more deserving. Somewhere along the way, the folks who supply our energy, though, adopted a business structure that's tilted more toward the investors in those utilities. So you realize the true reason why we almost lost our electrical grid, the big snowstorm, right? The way I understand it, it was because the profits that should have been reinvested in the physical plant were allocated instead to those investors. In the meantime, we're being amped up over things that are far less worthy of our attention than the open conspiracy that's being splitting us in half at the top. I mean, spin the wheel. Look at all these distraction topics here. Drag queens, an army of IRS agents, woke, border wall, groomers, Trump witch hunt, trans kids, coming to get our guns, Trump, CRT, Hunter Biden, socialism, migrant caravans, inflation, crime, and even restroom access. You see how that works? The PUC is an elected body, right? I'm just saying. But anyway, in one regard, what we're experiencing with the politicization of our educational system in this culture war is just the latest iteration of a much older theater of class warfare. Society's elite fired the first shot when the children of ordinary Americans first began attending public secondary school en masse at the end of the 19th century. At its core today remains the fixed notion that schooling the masses in the same manner as those who are to be their nation or to be their leaders invites political peril arising from the uncertainties of allowing rank and file people to wander away from the pursuits for which they're adapted. The pursuits for which they're adapted. Those pursuits did not include a seat at the table where men discussed ideas and made decisions. This attitude provoked an enduring philosophical divide over classroom pedagogy that survives to this day. One side became rooted in the Jeffersonian ideal that the responsibility of public education is to teach future citizens how to think, so they'll be able to judge for themselves what will secure or endanger their freedom. The other side thought to thwart egalitarianism by de-emphasizing the teaching of political history, where ideas, events, and institutions were shaped by individuals that history can hold accountable. As a continuing battle, on which side do you think the defenders of traditional history like Ms. Haas stand? Here's a hint. Of those two kinds of history, only one of them flows from the kind of liberal arts education that will help our future leaders navigate the nuances of a complicated world. I mean, my gosh, if everybody else started studying the same kind of history as their betters, it might make us question why one class of people can arbitrarily decide what pursuits another class of people are suited for. It might even compel us to inquire what kind of historical legacy has left so many workaday Texans with nothing but swagger to show for all the swag their heroes squeezed out of the wilderness and the land's original inhabitants. Let me digress for a second. One of Michelle's manipulative techniques is implying that being intellectuals means our backgrounds are unlike average Texans. Hey, my father was a high school football coach, man, and neither of my grandfathers, both of them born in the 1800s, could even read or write. They were sharecroppers, although my bohemian grandpa could at least read music. But anyway, but my old man, though, and he reached beyond that 8th grade education that most of our relatives on that side had begun achieving. And he went all the way through college on the merits of being big, mean, and fast. So if this is what happens when you teach a bunch of Hanyaks how to read and write, then maybe it would be in the best interest of the power elite to do exactly what they're doing in their so-called war on education. By the way, you heard me mention my sister has a PhD too. I didn't just drop that in there. I did that on purpose. I want to ask you, what was the situation when we could skip one generation and go from illiteracy to terminal degrees? Was that audible? I could have heard the wind whispered, white privilege, in Bernie Pruitt's voice. But, fair enough. But there were other factors too, though. You can't look at traditional history to explain that one because it has to do with matters of class, which stratifies white folks. If you'll notice, Michelle Haas changing race, class, and gender, she now calls it race, gender, and victim. And so anyway, now that I've raised this issue, let me ask whether you believe that our business leaders embrace the same kind of Texas history that Michelle Haas would have the masses know. Before you answer, let me mention a guy I wrote about, Ben Mosier. He's the intellectual that moved to the Netherlands. And anyway, he published an article about Texas books that was just straight up dismissive. Somewhere in there, he remarked that at St. John's in Houston, where he received his prep school training, that Texas history was a rhetorical exercise meant to teach study skills. In case you don't know, St. John's is an exclusive private school in River Oaks in Houston. It was the kind of place, Mosier said, that promoted the study of Latin and in the afternoon served tea and crumpets beneath oil paintings. The real historical subjects, ancient history, European history, and American history were still to come. I think you know the answer now. But anyway, the kinds of people who end up running oil companies and banks and other businesses that require layers of knowledge about what's going on all around them probably have a little more sophisticated grasp of the past than your average Texas history enthusiast. Governor Greg Abbott went to law school at Vanderbilt. Do you really think he conducts his business with of being governor with a gun smoke and horseshit grasp of history? If he looks foolish occasionally, that's not the reason. It's because he has to defend some indefensible issues in pursuit of the fixes for the shell game they're playing on all of us. By the way, Ms. Haas also whined incessantly about Walter Binger being head of this and in charge of that. But who appointed her spokesperson for a bunch of people that she keeps constantly agitated? And you remember the Brer Rabbit tale about the skunk who told old Brer Possum his breath stinks? If you'll notice, she rebukes scholars for telling everyone how to think, and then in the same breath, she's telling everyone how to think. So there's that. But anyway, now let me read you another excerpt. It's a quick one, though. The human response to being confronted with realities that can contradict our understanding of the big picture is to rationalize credible scenarios that make them fit or simply declare them anomalies. The question then arises, how many times can our understanding of the past deflect such challenges before we finally begin wondering whether we've been wrong all along? The bête noire, the thing to be avoided for true Texans pulling on the long end of the rope, is the prospect that all those Texans pulling on the short end of the rope will reach a critical mass that represents the fatal dose of reality, leading them abruptly to let go. If that day arrives, the social order, as Texans know it, will be up for grabs. And that, my friends, accounts for Michelle's frantically aggressive approach. And again, it's not about understanding. It's about power. She's punking you. As long as you remain confused and pissed off, the power elite wins. I'm not so sure about J.P. Bryan. Not long after Lone Star Mine came out, I visited him at his museum in Galveston, and it was really impressive. Here's a man who loves Texas history, and he's upset that the kind of Texas history he enjoys has been alternately demonized and ignored since 1990. And I could share that concern with him for the many reasons outlined in that book. One of its general themes was that if scholars didn't get ahead of the curve, that we'd end up right where we are now. So anyway, but before leaving, I gave Mr. Bryan a copy of my volume and made sure to tell him that he wasn't going to like much of what I wrote, but I asked him if he'd just look at the first two chapters, which critique traditional history like an old jalopy you're restoring. If you're hoping to get it back on the road and you want to do it right, you got to start by sandblasting it down to the metal. But I pointed out to him that the next two chapters did the same thing to scholarship. I finished by telling him that the traditional history returns in the last chapter, but just in a different form than the one I ripped up, and one that should be an important part of our identity as 21st century Texans. That's about the point where he looked up at me and goes, I didn't understand a word you just said. And maybe that was his way of telling me I wasn't making as much sense as I thought I was. I was talking a little too fast, but I'll give him that one. But he's had that book for 5 years now. And judging by the poem that he tattooed on the inside of the TSHA program last spring, I'll venture he hasn't dog-eared many pages. I'm sure all of you know the poem I'm referring to. It said in effect that being critical of your legends is a sign of society's decline. Let's presume, as I contended, that our society is evolving into an entirely new era. In that regard, you got to look at it this way. Being critical of your legends is the first step toward rehabilitating a more complex story by taking on shades of gray that make the story real and more important. As scholars, we're just not executing that last step, and it's a really, really big one. Assessing the moral costs lends gravity and consequence to whatever narrative comes out of it. And as societies mature, they grow more reflective, and two-dimensional stories just drag around too much baggage to continue working like they used to. But as scholars, we're not explaining that very well. Clearly, all of us on both sides need to knock it up a notch. Let's begin with a reality check for knocking it up a notch here. The introduction of Lone Star Mine, it opens with a quotation by J.P. Bryan, declaring that there have been more books written about Texas than all the other states combined. So you take every other book written about other states in Texas, the stack would be higher. Like so many tall tales about our state, this Texas fun fact that Bryan imagined has no basis. In fact, it simply gained the force of credibility among Texans by being retold over and over again. In reality, the number of Texas books compares favorably with that of, what state do you think? Massachusetts. Yeah. Otherwise, you can look at like New York and California. Hell, publishers have laid the axe to roughly half again as many trees on behalf of those states than they have on Texas. But anyway, this kind of dunce hat aggrandizement tends to make people look foolish, and especially when they know it and then they keep going out and saying it. And that said, I've got to wonder whether Mr. Bryan is fully aware about what's going on here between the two ground level sides in our little corner of the larger culture where I was just talking about. I wasn't so sure about him because on one side, It's about the writing of history. The other side, the side that he chose to be on, is not about the writing of history. Texas history needs repairing, obviously. I believe our field will recalibrate, and when we do, I believe traditionalists won't be nearly as upset as they are now. The side Mr. Bryan has joined is dedicated to sabotaging any effort that involves reconciliation. They're not straying from the power elite's bottom line, which is to avoid seeking a common usable past by sowing the politics of division. It is imperative to them that our membership remains agitated and in chaos. By the way, repairing it doesn't involve one side winning and one side losing. It involves reconciliation and consensus. And as long as Michelle Haas and J.P. Bryan can keep their side up in arms, we'll have neither, and the power elite, for which they are mercenaries, wins. This stalemate between progressives, historians, and traditionalists, it's going to be over long before that 200th anniversary of Texas independence comes around, because the politics that subsume it going to be mostly settled in a couple of years. In fact, if it weren't for the politics, we probably wouldn't be doing this at all. So at the end of the day, Michelle Haas and Mr. Bryan, all they're doing is putting off that moment when Texans can begin to work on regaining a common identity and values. So what's it going to be, Mr. Bryan? If you truly want a Texas history that includes traditional aspects of our past, you're not going to get it from that human monkey wrench grinding her way through our machinery. Of course, right now, you're not getting it from scholarship either, but I believe we'll start correcting course when we begin framing our work around the circumstances of epical change. But it's time for some statesmanship, man. When 2036 comes around and Texans reflect on this moment in time, Mr. Bryan and I probably won't be around to pop firecrackers, but are they going to say that he made a wise move and pulled the ripcord on this walking fraud alert, or are they going to look at him and point, yeah, that's the guy who tried to burn the house down? We'll know soon enough. But dude, let me give you a tip. If you're going to say that Anglo efforts settled the western part of the United States for the purpose of spreading freedom for all, you might want to qualify that, because without doing that, someone might presume that you meant spreading freedom was for whites only. Stand up on your hind legs and say that if that's what you mean, man. But after all, it's a perfect projection of the traditional meta-narrative that you cling to. In the age we're moving toward, however, that kind of explanation, man, that's going to stamp and seal your irrelevance. For someone who professes to care about Texas history, I cannot think of a sadder or a more ignoble legacy to leave, but I also can't think of anyone who's more deserving of bringing it on themselves. Now, let's say for argument's sake that I'm at least on the right path. In that case, don't you think it would be in the best interest of traditionalists to look for ways to remain relevant? And there are so many ways. Just as we're on the verge of reconceptualizing our field, a mission of reconciliation that will take the cooperation of both sides, looks to me like Mr. Bryan is ready to just jump in the ash can of history. So hop on in there with Michelle Haas and pull the lid shut on yourselves, Mr. Bryan, because I'm telling you, that is not a winning square to stack your chips on. The only question left about Michelle Haas is whether she's actively working on behalf of the power elite, or whether she's just merely a useful idiot. I think Mr. Bryan has proven in many ways which category he fits in. But what a useful idiot is? There's actually a term. It's political jargon used to reference a person that perceived as propagandizing for a cause, particularly a bad cause, originating from a devious, ruthless source, without fully comprehending the cause's goals, and someone who's cynically being used by the cause's leaders. Now, for all the earth she's scorching, damn, I hope Michelle's getting compensated. Otherwise, it knocks stupid up to a whole nother level, I think. So anyway, let's switch gears a minute and talk about intellectual humility. Then I'll wrap things up by framing this culture war as a contest of meta-narratives. Now, did any of you gasp when I just said that? No, I mean, I made the rough transition to emphasize a contrast here. If you think about humility, if you think that talking about humility is inconsistent with the contempt I've expressed for Michelle Haas and J.P. Bryan, I'm going to check you on that. If you've if you've watched the video, if you do watch the video I referred you to, the earlier one, you'll see me treat Michelle Haas with much more respect than she deserved. Again, as long as I thought she was educable. But hey, now we know what her grift is, and all bets are off. And personally, my sense of humility does not extend to someone whose end game is gaslighting my friends and acquaintances and turning them against each other. Everything Michelle Haas has said has been calculated to pull at base emotions rather than appealing to logic. That's a sophomoric manipulative technique that deserves to be called out. If I have an opportunity to discredit her personally and denounce her vituperative rhetoric, I will drop down on her like Batman every chance I get. Let me remind you, we're in a war, a culture war, where the power elite is playing for keeps. We've got people on both sides clinging to some rigid views, pushing everyone farther into their own corners. The stakes could not be higher. Let me tell you something. The world's a complicated place, and we get farther away from understanding it when we abandon logic and cloud our minds with emotion. When we shoehorn the evidence we've collected into our ideological constructs, when we discount the words of our opponents simply because the words are coming out of their mouths and pens, yet that's the world we live in, and I'm talking to both sides here. At a time when the search for truth has got particularly bumpy and complicated, it would be wise to acknowledge that no one has all the answers. It doesn't help when both sides think they're seizing the moral high ground and they start preaching down to people who are not receptive to their message. At least there's one thing, though, that everybody seems sure of, that the other side is wrong. So we've got that in common. But let's step back from the moral prisms we're looking through and talk about intellectual humility for a moment then. This is the quality that means you're willing to accept that you might be wrong about something and then not get defensive when you encounter evidence that proves it. That happened to me about 1,000 times when I was working on this book. As a research historian, I have to make observations and try to make sense out of them and try to reach some informed conclusions. I can only go with the evidence that's sitting in front of me and be willing to change my mind on new evidence and ideas. In this regard, I believe that social historians lost their way by becoming advocates. That is, the postmodern idea of sacrificing a measure of objectivity for advocating your cause. Remember when I mentioned outdated attitudes and behaviors holding us back? That's one of them. That's a big one. I was a graduate student in the late 1980s when New Western history was all the rage. I recall listening to a lecture that Patricia Lemick delivered at a symposium at TCU. She framed her work as a challenge to traditional history and said it was okay for historians to be advocates. I drew a mental line in the sand that day and determined never to cross it. Personally, I believe being advocates has a double whammy of arrogance and intellectual lassitude. Guess I should thank New Western historians for letting their field clabber so badly that it provided me instruction for examining our own house. I've got a chapter on Texas and regionalism. New Western historians don't come out so well. With that, though, let me pose a question to my friends on both sides of this culture war. Do you just want to win your argument, or do you want to gain some true understanding? It is possible to have strong opinions without being inflexible about what you believe. That's the point where you begin rationalizing why you're right, rather than entertaining the evidence that contradicts your beliefs. And I think we're all guilty of doing that at some point. But I was looking at a volume recently, Think Again, by a Wharton psychologist, that said in a world where smart people presume they have all the answers, he found that self-righteousness tends to blow up in your face. It can lead to a mean little place where admiration for your own brilliance turns into inordinate scorn for the jerks on the other side. I think we're already there, and we've been there for a while now. The author, Adam Grant, he was pushing intellectual humility, and there's a good lesson in there. He found that those who make the most incisive analysis were not the smartest, but rather those who were willing to view evidence dispassionately and were willing to change their minds. As one who's painfully aware of my limitations, I thought, cool, because that was the approach I used. There were times when I had to stop and read a book just to finish writing a paragraph. Seriously. When that happens, you begin to realize how fragile your arguments can be. So becoming self-aware of our biases and acknowledging how our feelings can throw us off course provides a good setup for discussing how I frame this culture war as a contest of meta-narratives. I believe the way that things have developed, this concept will seem a lot clearer now than when I first proposed it, and that it provides as dispassionate an approach as you're going to get for contextualizing our history and organizing in a way that's capable of entertaining conflicting thoughts. I'll do this briefly by paraphrasing about 4 or 5 pages from a section in the book titled Texas and the Cultural Turn. But let me begin with an excerpt from the paragraph that precedes it. It says, without piecing together grand narratives, which, although imperfect, at least include as a feature a broad understanding of how constructs of power and language are manufactured and at what cost their proponents maintain them, then progressive scholars might as well retreat into those cavernous halls of academe where they can write discourses for consumption by like-minded colleagues. Wider audiences enraptured by a fool's parade of opinionated guests on cable television outlets and talk radio will never be the wiser. End of quote. But I suppose we could add Michelle Haas and YouTube to that, huh? So along comes the cultural turn, which gives progressive scholars a pass on the ideological insistence that so often paints them into the corner. It has demonstrated its effectiveness by absorbing and assimilating social history rather than overtaking it, and it's capable of doing the same thing with traditional history as well. The cultural turn has a chance to make an extraordinary impact on historical thought and practice, especially where its underlying pragmatism discards the postmodern principle of rejecting meta-narratives out of hand. By the way, earlier I mentioned the traditional meta-narrative. True Texans wrested the land from the wilderness, the Indians and the Mexicans, and that's not really a point that's debatable. I mean, it's something that both Walter and Michelle have agreed upon, even though Walter was inclined to reject meta-narratives out of principle. He mentioned it, he meant it as a kick-me sign, and not incidentally, it was a meta-narrative, and one that traditionalists had already embraced. That the state's most prominent traditionalist, a lay historian, the state's most prominent traditionalist was a lay historian. He first turned that phrase in 1968, unblushingly, I might have. He even doubled down by saying, and I quote, "To doubt that experience is to question the entire meaning of the true Texan's existence." You got to understand that back in the day, postmodernists pointed out that grand narratives it enabled institutions of the state to amplify their power by manipulating the thoughts and actions of individuals. Guess it never occurred to them that they could do what the cultural turn has done, that is by turning the notion against itself by identifying and analyzing particular sites of power and then showing how they can truly be understood only one way, and that's as sites of agency as well as repression. So anyway, people focused on the repression of it before. But anyway, a meta-narrative setting into motion a synthesis that strikes a balance between expressions of progressive scholarship and a revised and appropriately contextualized traditional history requires one that's able to reconcile the conflicts inherent in those two worldviews. So let me give you the meta-narrative or grand thesis, whatever you want to call it, that helped me achieve a measure of objectivity and make sense of the relationship between history and current events. Then I'll put it into perspective. Here's the meta-narrative, though. It says that Texans in pursuit of self-interest, viewed alongside the ascendancy of Anglo-Male hegemony and the challenges to its authority attendant in the cycles of the state's development, explains the history of Texas. Let me break that down. When I say Texans in pursuit of self-interest, I'm talking about all Texans, regardless of which side you're on in this culture war. It is cast as a tug of war between. It is cast between a tug of war between self-titled true Texans and everyone else, but it doesn't have to eclipse the traditional view. It can make it part of a new usable past that is truthful and one that is capable of projecting the ways, values, and identities of traditionalists. But anyway, beginning even before the revolution, the challenges to its authority, the Anglo-male authority, are defined in each chapter in every textbook on Texas history. So think about what this meta-narrative does. Right now, you've got two sides with an us versus them attitude, fighting over the exclusive rights to tell the story of our Texas past. By looking at how all Texans pursued their self-interests, it can remove the us versus them out of the equation. It also moves the center of gravity out of the revolution and frontier, and which is something I noticed holding us back as the bicentennial of Texas independence gets closer every 4 months when the Southwestern Historical Quarterly drops a new issue. Plus, I want to, just who is us and who is them? I mean, really, this meta-narrative envisions Texas as a community of interconnected, competing cultures. They don't stay the same. You ever hear the joke about the Lone Ranger and Tonto? Talking about community not staying the same, but anyway, Tonto and the Lone Ranger surrounded by 1,000 Comanche warriors, and so the Ranger looks over and goes, "Gee, Tonto, looks like we got ourselves into a pickle here, huh?" And predictably, Tonto responds by looking at him and going, "Who you calling a wee, paleface?" And anyway, his self-interest suddenly changed. Get it? As old Dr. Proctor would have said, a little humor there, very little. But my point, though, is that cultures are dynamic. Think of them like Venn diagrams, all the little circles that overlap each other. Our self-interests are always in motion because they're never completely static. We can understand the self-interests of Texans only by gaining appreciation for the historical forces that have formed and reconfigured the relationships among them. Now wrap your minds around this. In 1936, Texas History, coming out of San Jacinto, said that in 18 minutes, Anglo men seized the right to chart their own course. In its broadest terms, you can understand what happened afterwards by viewing Texas history as a record of Anglo men consolidating their gains and protecting them against all comers. In 2036, though, we're going to be viewing Texas history through the lens of epical change. A primary focus on those othered out of the traditional narrative will envision the battle's aftermath as the first steps in a long, arduous journey to gain the same rights and privileges of society that Anglo men seized for themselves in 18 minutes. Now, you'd think, as an enlightened democratic, with a little d, enlightened democratic society, in a state where a lot of Christians make their home, that people would take pride in a story that demonstrates the values of egalitarianism. In that chase, man, maybe you should look up and see who's overlapping your circle. Remember what I said, what happens when your political identity becomes more important than your religious identity? When that happens, you're going to be looking like a hypocrite a lot of the times. But, thinking about the role that faith plays on all this stuff, I'm just going to throw this out there. I remember in my childhood, growing up in East Texas, and we attended church every Sunday. There were some Bible passages that just floated around. I mean, you'd hear them all the time. The meek shall inherit the earth. You can't worship both God and mammon. Is it just me, or do a lot of problems certain Christians seem to be having stem from wandering away from their meta-narrative? That meta-narrative of Christianity is right, John 3:16. Just saying. So moving right along, I mentioned scholars earlier who would begrudge the accomplishment of a society whose benefits accrued mostly to Anglo men and then dwell inordinately on the social costs. And that couldn't be truer, but at the same time, the unwillingness of traditionalists to acknowledge the price tag social historians dwell on is the single greatest issue closing them, the traditionalists that is, out of any conversation they might enjoy having with progressives. But I had talked about my experience with the people around Albany, Texas in the previous lecture, and the point makes a good place to close. The first book I wrote, Lone Star Mine, a Texas Frontier, it set out to explore what happened during the 23 hours and 55 minutes of the day when people around Fort Griffin weren't killing each other, but there were just so many ridiculous stories of violence and folklore that need to be set straight. Well, clueless me, hell, I was expecting everyone out there to be fascinated. Man, to my surprise, most of them came out fuming. They liked their social history, or they liked their history the way that their fathers and grandfathers liked it, and the way that they thought that their great-grandfathers had lived it. Wresting this particular land from the wilderness, the Comanches, and the farmers, though, came with some high moral price tags, and they felt my book was a way of presenting them with a bill that no one wanted to pay. Their reaction had me questioning why I wrote the book in the first place. Then something happened that I didn't expect. It took a minute, but eventually the people came to realize that what really happened was more compelling than the fairy tale. After they simmered down, they came to realize that what was embarrassing at first actually made what happened there more important. For the people who occupy the land now, it lent gravity to their own experience. On top of everything else, it tied that Fort Griffin area to other movements in the American West that added resonance to their part of Texas. So, in other words, it took a while for all the tumblers to fall into place, but when they did, it gave those people out there a new sense of historicity. And you know what? It hasn't dulled their love for gun smoke and horseshit any more than learning the truth about Santa Claus has dulled our Christmas cheer. It's as simple as that. So, think about that. But traditional history needs to take a similar approach. And there are narrative historians, traditionalists, who are indeed doing that without surrendering the focus on their own interests and from their point of view. When they do that, scholars who write historiographies need to acknowledge their merits. Now, at the end of the day, a lot of what's fueling this culture war is being manufactured by the power elite. My advice to both sides is cut the puppet strings and quit thinking with your emotions so we can set about the task of repairing our filth. It would be a worthy accomplishment if we could get together and give Texans a usable past that cultivates a new common identity that's worthy of leading us into the bicentennial of our independence and beyond. The goal of reconciliation and consensus, though, begins with closing the gap in this culture war. That brings us to a close here. And just as I've signed off every lecture for the past 20 years, Smirtavashim Hovim Olam. Goodbye.